When the scribes and Pharisees asked our Lord about the greatest commandment, he replied, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." So why do we hear some of today's most prominent pastors saying things like this?
It had everything to do with how we talk about the Bible, and specifically, or along with that, what we point to as the foundation of faith, which for most Christians, unfortunately, is the Bible.
We need to do better. We need to love God with all our hearts and stand unashamedly on the rock of his word. We need to love the Lord with all of our souls and respond to the worldview issues of our day with the wisdom and discernment that comes only from him. We need to love the Lord with our minds and understand the calling of God's people in every area of life in God's world. We need to love the Lord our God with all our strength and face the work of building a life-giving, God-honoring culture. Join us for 4 days at the Cultural Leadership Academy as we consider how the gospel influences all of life and culture and the role that we have to play in applying foundational Christian thinking to every area of life.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to the podcast for Cultural Reformation, a ministry of the Ezra Institute. It's here that we equip emerging Christian cultural leaders with biblical worldview, Christian philosophy, and cultural apologetic studies. We do that through residential training programs and our digital resources. And I'm back, as is mostly the case, on a weekly basis, and I'm here with Dr. Michael Thiessen, one of our hosts and one of our staff members in the United States, and a very special guest today with us on the show, our fellow for Public Policy, Tim Dieppe, who is head of public policy at the London-based organization Christian Concern, who do tremendous work in the United Kingdom in public advocacy and also in basically defending Christians through the courts who are facing one degree of marginalization or persecution or another. And they've won a number of important and significant cases. And they're also involved in equipping and training Christians too, to understand the cultural situation for believers and to defend the truth of the gospel. They speak about Jesus in public life. So Tim is an old friend, and in the sense that I've known him a long time, not that he's particularly old, but he is a good friend of the ministry and somebody that I've had the opportunity over many years now to work with, and who is extremely knowledgeable about our subject that we're addressing today in our ongoing Presuppositions and Conversations series that we've been engaged in these past few weeks. And this week we are dealing with the topic of Islam. So we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But before we get into our subject for today, I'm going to ask the incredibly handsome Michael Thiessen to do some housekeeping for us and let us know what's going on in the ecosystem that is the Ezra Institute. Michael, let me hand it. Looks like you've had your haircut or at least been restyled. I like it. But anyway, over to you just to tell us what's going on with Ezra right now.
Joe, life must be good in London. You are just excited and complimentary today. This is a lovely Joe. Tim, it's great. I'm really looking forward to listening to you and hearing all you're going to say on Islam. Folks, really important for everybody who's listening. We have a number of summer events coming up, and it's imperative that if you've been thinking about attending, if you've been thinking about signing one of your young adults up, that you just go and do it today. We're in the month of May. We would love to have all of our camps filled up, our academies filled up and ready to go so we can just plan them and execute them and have a great summer. So first of all, Worldview Youth Academy, July 12th to 18th. This is our U.S. Youth Academy, and that's going to occur in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. our second Worldview Youth Academy in Canada. That will be July 28th to August 2nd. That's going to be in Port Colborne, Ontario. For those of you who have sent your kids in the past, same location in Canada. For those of you who are sending your kids for the first time in the U.S., we have a fantastic mountain resort there in Gatlinburg. So sign your young adults up for Worldview Youth Academy right now. But also, we are piloting a new project, something that we're very excited about. This is the Ezra Family Camp. We're partnering with a number of churches in Minnesota to come together August 25th to 28th as families. And so, you know, Joe, I've even been talking to people on the phone where they're thinking about bringing 3 generations. They're thinking about bringing kids, mom and dad, and grandparents to our event. And so this is going to be a wonderful event. We're having good signups. If you want to attend the Ezra Family Camp, join us at Camp Gym in Minnesota. So everybody, if you're coming, you're going to increase your understanding of life and culture and the kingship of Christ, which is so important to transform your worldview. Go to the EzraInstitute.com and register today. And Joe, I'm really excited. The more we're working on these upcoming camps, I know as a staff, we're getting excited about them. Folks, go sign up today. And that is all this gorgeous face has to say at this time.
Okay, don't overdo it. I was purely trying to improve my sanctification, but let's not overstate the matter. Thank you, Michael.
Just stay there. Good.
So it's an exciting summer for Ezra, and we are looking forward to those academies and programs this summer, and we hope you're going to join us. We're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the show now with Tim Dieppe. And we're going to hear a bit about Tim's work. He'll give us a short summary of that. Our topic is Islam. In particular, we want to be thinking about the challenge of Islamization in the West, which we've been seeing quite significantly displayed on the streets, in the universities, in shopping malls, whether it's Toronto, London, campuses in the United States, Oxford, Cambridge, wherever. And more attention is actually being drawn to this subject of Islam. So before I come to Tim, I just want us to take a quick look at these scenes from London in the last few weeks that have given us a bit of an insight into what's going on.
From London to Gaza, to the Intifada, victory to the Intifada, victory to the faith, Palestine will be free, to the faith, Palestine will be free.
Months I've been standing up here talking about the people on our streets demanding death to Jews, demanding jihad, demanding intifadas, as the police stand by and allow that to happen. Last night, a genocidal call for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, was projected onto this building. That message says no Jew is welcome in the state of Israel or in that land.
Well, Andrew Percy there, very, very passionate, and I think absolutely right. And let's just have a look at what was projected onto Big Ben last night. This is quite extraordinary. And there it is, from the river to the sea, projected onto Big Ben in central London. Now, we know what from the river to the sea means. It means the abolition of the state of Israel and frankly, the eradication of the Jewish people that live there as well.
Tim, great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us. I know that your time is precious, and so we really appreciate this, and we value all the input you've given to the Ezra Institute over the years. As we kick this off, Tim, why don't you
Thanks, pleasure.
Oh, it's great to have you. Can you just give us a short summary, just for the sake of our listeners, of the nature of Islam? What is Islam? People often think, Christians often think that hopefully those who listen to this show know a lot better because we've talked about it frequently, but often think that Islam's like Christianity, but just with a few differences here and there. And that's really all we need to know. Just give us a brief definition of what Islam actually is.
Yeah, sure. So Islam, I define Islam according to its text. I don't know where else you go if you're going to define Islam. So Islam is really defined by its text. The texts are the Quran and the Hadith. Those are the sayings of Muhammad, which are also regarded as authoritative Muslims, and the Sirah, or the biography of Muhammad as well, which is also regarded as kind of sacred record by Muslims. And that's really what Islam is. Now, what Muslims think may be different to that. Many people claim to be Muslims and claim they believe Muhammad and so on. They have a sort of romantic view of what Muhammad is like. But I want to go back to the text, and that's what the actual scholars and serious theologians of Islam do. And many Muslims don't read the text in their own language. They're not really encouraged to do that, like Christians encourage us. We encourage people to read the Bible and ask questions, whereas Muslims are not generally encouraged to read the Quran in a language they understand. And they're actually discouraged from asking questions. It's seen as disrespectful to do that. So many Muslims don't really know what Islam teaches. But to get to the point, I wrote an article a few years ago called "Is Islam a Religion of Peace?" And for a long time, it's like one of the top 3 results on Google. If you just Google that phrase, "Is Islam a Religion of Peace?" It's currently about number 10 or something like that. It was about 1, 2, 3 for about 5 years. Thousands of people read that piece. And I commend it to you and your listeners as a sort of summary of why I think Islam is not a religion of peace, ultimately, as defined by its texts. Again, to distinguish, that's not to say all Muslims believe these texts or accept these texts or so on, but those that want to go back to the text, they're going to see that Muhammad was a warrior, a fighter, advocated jihad as a physical jihad, and so on. And the texts that appear peaceful are regarded as being abrogated by the more violent texts that occurred later in his life when he was more powerful and able to exert his military force over other people and so on. This is the track record of Islam through its history, that it has conquered and expanded through the sword. So Islam is a religion that combines politics and religion, contrast to Christianity, where Jesus famously said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's," and the separation of church and state is there, as well as in the Old Testament, the difference between the prophets and the kings and so on. Islam, it's all one, it's all united, and so Islam has political aspirations in a way that Christianity does not, and seeks political influence and to politically rule over places where it gains dominance. So that is that a good summary?
Yeah,
for
that's
you,
excellent.
Joe, for the time being?
Yeah, I was answering a question similar to that just the other day, and I was pointing out that one of the great differentiators between Christianity and Islam in terms of that issue politically is the principle of sphere sovereignty. Sphere sovereignty does not exist in the Islamic world and life view of the notion of a separation of jurisdictions or spheres of authority of family, church, state. It has a totalitarian concept of life. Tim, can you tell us then about the link or the relationship between Islam and Sharia law? Oftentimes, we often sort of led to believe that these two things, Islam and Sharia, are kind of Sharia is sort of optional for the Muslim, as though these kinds of they're somehow separate. What can you tell us about the relationship of Islam and Sharia law that will help people understand the relationship?
Yeah, sure. Well, Sharia law is really the system or the rules for life. For a Muslim, it's like the way to live your life. And Sharia law governs pretty much every aspect of what you do. I mean, there are rules about how to go outside, how to pray, how to eat, what things to eat, and so on. An incredible number of rules really in Sharia law But the fundamental ones are found in the Quran, and then you have the Hadith as well. And there are Sharia judges. Here in the UK, you may not know, but we have something like 85 plus Sharia courts that operate in a kind of quasi-judicial capacity in Islamic communities where there's kind of like a monoculture in a particular area. They don't go to the police, they don't go to the normal law system, they go to a Sharia court to resolve their disputes. And the Sharia court judges there will rule according to Sharia law, which states that a woman's voice is worth half a man's voice. And in Sharia law, famously, a man can divorce his wife by just saying, I divorce you 3 times, whereas it's very hard for a woman to obtain a divorce. And women are very often paying quite a lot of money to these Sharia courts in order to try and obtain a Sharia divorce from a husband who has divorced them or left them or deserted them or died even. And unless their marriage is registered in UK law, they have no rights for that. And very often these women have been married in a mosque and they thought it was registered legally, but it is not. And that their only recourse is Sharia law to try and obtain some justice there. And so we have areas of the country where basically de facto system for disputes is Sharia law, effectively already here in the UK, which is quite shocking and disturbing in itself.
Yeah. So that would be an aspect of, we often hear the term now, Islamization. Perhaps we can talk about that just for a moment before we come to some of the sort of very visible things that have been going on in the last number of months. But Islamization in general concerns basically the influence and the impact of these ideas within a Western context under a so-called doctrine of multiculturalism in the secular state. We're seeing an increase in Islamization. When we talk about that, what do we really mean by it? Because very often, again, Christians are often ignorant of what that means in finance, what that means with food, what that means with dress code, what it means with courts, and not just the visible presence of mosques being built, and in some places now even Islamic calls to prayer, but there's a variety of things that this implies. What is Islamization as you see it, and what is its ultimate goal in the Western context?
Yeah, sure. Well, I agree with the way you've defined it there, really, the increasing influence of Islam on our society, the increasing influence of Islamic culture and Islamic norms and Islamic systems and so on, whether that occurs in finance, where we have Sharia finance and government Sharia bonds here in the UK, whether that occurs in education, which is a very, very key battleground, both at the university level and at the school level, and we can come on to that. But, whether it occurs at the realm of sort of people disrespecting the Quran, so-called, having police, call them and people complaining vociferously about it, whether it's at the realm of allegations of Islamophobia being thrown about for anybody who ever says anything slightly critical of Islam or quotes what the Quran says or something like that, and therefore, an introduction of a quasi sort of Islamic blasphemy code because you're being labelled as phobic if you criticise Islam, and there are plans here to propose a legal definition of Islamophobia, which we can come on to if you want, which would basically enforce an Islamic blasphemy law. Or whether it's just in the realm of something like halal food. Pretty much, if you go to any restaurant or chain that offers chicken or lamb here in the UK, that will be ritually slaughtered, and an Islamic prayer will have been said over it. So there's Islamization right there for you. And whether it's at the other realm of things like no Easter lights in London to celebrate Easter, but Ramadan, huge displays and lights and things about Ramadan there. So we're all learning to respect Ramadan as a festival here in the UK, while Christianity is kind of silenced and kept quiet, and no real signs of that, and considered offensive if we do try and display or make issues or make a fuss about Christian festivals, and so on. And or whether it's at the worst case in the realm of kind of jihad and terrorist attacks and so on, and MPs being murdered. We've had 2 MPs murdered by jihadists here in the UK, or one stabbed, one murdered, and another step down as a result of Islamic threats to him. So influencing democracy, MPs saying to journalists, I considered my safety when I decided how to vote on a controversial motion about Gaza. In other words, the threat of violence from Islamists is affecting our democracy now. Clearly, there's a whole realm of areas, all sort of different ways, different areas, fashion as well, where Islam is encroaching on our culture and changing our culture. And in some cases, like there's a book about the lament of Dewsbury. I mean, Dewsbury used to be a traditional British Yorkshire town with pubs and restaurants and chains like McDonald's and all of that. It's become an Islamic town, and all of the pubs and chains and restaurants have left, and there are basically no-go areas for non-Muslims in that town. It's now the headquarters of Tablighi Jamaat, which is a fundamentalist radical Islamic group. The headquarters for that in the whole of Europe is up in Dewsbury in Yorkshire. And the town has been Islamized, basically. And there are other local areas like that. And then, you have, the book written by, I forgot his name now, but it's called Among the Mosques. And he went and visited the various big mosques in all the major towns, London, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Birmingham, and so on, and found every single Islamic bookstore you can find radical Islamic texts of the kind that are banned in Saudi Arabia freely for sale here in the UK. So many examples like this that illustrate that Islam is very much gaining influence and is confident, and people are afraid to criticize it, afraid to say something against it. And whereas Christianity is fair game to criticize and ridicule and mock and accuse of being discriminatory and harsh and so on, Islam was treated with kid gloves and respect, whilst it also threatens with violence.
Tim, one of the ways that we've seen that happen in Canada is that the federal government is actually introducing the support of halal mortgages. The government right now is coming out saying this is not a government of Canada product, but they're showing support for it. And here's the explanation in a recent news article about it. A halal mortgage is a real estate financing method that complies with Islamic principles and teachings. Under Sharia law, it is forbidden for Muslims to receive and pay interest. So a halal mortgage essentially takes interest out of the equation. There's a direct reference point to Sharia law in the explanation as to why the Canadian federal government is supporting this type of financing. And my question for you, Tim, on that is this mass immigration, this Islamification intentional? I think that's another concept that people find difficult to understand. That like, is this a type of takeover? Yeah. Is this a type of crusade, if you will? Like, is this a type of warfare where there is some intentionality going to just moving to a place and then imposing Islamic will?
Yes. So let me first of all talk about Islamic finance, because I'm a bit of an expert on that. I wrote a booklet called What's Wrong with Islamic Finance? And maybe somebody can share the link on that for those watching. But I used to work in finance. And in fact, I was asked to run a Sharia fund at one point, and I had to object to that and say, I don't want to run a Sharia fund because I'd be endorsing Sharia law, and Sharia law discriminates against both women and non-Muslims and so on. And I didn't get much support from my colleagues about that. But when I researched it, what you find is that the Quran, similar to the Bible, really prohibits usury or extortionate interest and does not, in any normal reading, prohibit interest full stop. But modern radical Muslims have interpreted it that way and said that the Quran prohibits interest altogether. It really is a modern idea. It's only come up in the 20th century. This idea wasn't most Muslims throughout history and most Muslims today throughout the world are very happy to have bank accounts and mortgages and so on with interest. But the radical Muslims will say, no, you shouldn't do that. You mustn't do that because the Quran prohibits interest. And so there are radical or followers of radical Muslims who will say, yes, I must have a Sharia compliant loan, which basically is interest in disguise. If you go, I've got a picture in the little booklet of an advert for a Sharia mortgage, and it's like, do you want a variable rent or a fixed rent. But it's the same as interest, it's crazy. They're just calling it rent and having a slightly different, more complicated legal structure so they can call it rent when really it's interest at the end of the day, and having some Sharia advisors sign off on it to say that this is totally compliant. And when I was looking into this, the then chairman of HSBC's Sharia Advisory Board is a chap called Taki Osmani, and he had written a book in English. And in this book, he raises a hypothetical question: do we still need to wage jihad in a country like Britain where we can freely preach Islam and build mosques? And he says in his answer, according to the Quran, killing should continue until they pay the jizya tax. And so, which you may know is a subjugation tax for non-Muslims, as dhimmis, where they pay anything up to like 50% of their income for the right to stay alive. And so he's saying he's totally advocating full-on hardline Sharia law where non-Muslims pay a subjugation tax for the privilege of staying alive. And if they don't, you kill them. I wrote to my friend at HSBC and said, do you really think this chap should be on your Sharia advisory board? And he quite rightly passed it on to their compliance department, who had a panic and got rid of him. But that opened my eyes to what Sharia finance is about, because he was the chair of the HSBC Sharia advisory board at the time. And the reason he was advocating Sharia finance, because he wants full-on Sharia law, absolutely radical, totally, kill people who don't pay the jizya tax. That's what he wants. And so this idea of bringing in Sharia finance, the agenda behind it is to basically, create some element of Sharia that people find hard to criticize, and therefore they think Sharia is not too bad. And once you've got Sharia finance, you might find it harder to criticize Sharia family law. And once you have Sharia family law, before you know it, you've got full-on Sharia law, and that is their aim. And that the aim is to legitimize Sharia, and as well as a separate aim of kind of creating a rival separate financial system and separating Islamic finance from other finance, and all of these aims that I outline in my little booklet there. So yes, the agenda behind this is full-on Islamization of society, and it's extraordinary that mainstream financial institutions like HSBC and even mainstream governments like the British government and the Canadian government have fallen in with this and gone along with it and felt like, oh yes, the Muslims say we've got to do this, therefore we've got to provide for them because they've said this is a Sharia law and they've got to abide by Sharia law. Well, no, you don't have to do it, and they shouldn't be doing it, and they shouldn't be providing for it, and they certainly shouldn't be issuing. Britain was the first non-Muslim country in the world to issue a government Sharia bond. They've issued 2 bonds like that now. And as Britain said, we want to become the Islamic finance capital of the world, and this is totally playing into the Islamization script.
Tim, this is, you use the expression jihad, which we hadn't yet used on the show, although it should be a familiar word to most of our listeners. For most people, the word jihad, if they're familiar with Islam, conjures up basically, specifically violence, war, intifada. We're told, of course, that by the apologists for Islam that it just means struggle, and they try and downplay the elements of force involved. They refer to it as more of an internal spiritual struggle, as opposed to the desire to impose Sharia on a country or to have an intifada revolution, or to be, forcing the jizya tax, which has a very long history in terms of Islamic interaction with non-Islamic countries. So just talk for a minute about jihad. I've got one more sort of major topic I want to address with you, because that's very topical right now. But just talk a little bit about jihad. That these things, as really that you've talked about as an expression of jihad, its real meaning, and why is it, as a sort of part B of the question, why is it that so few people, including in government, recognize the threat that Islam as an ideology, that this jihad actually represents? So that's a 2-part question. The first part, talking about the meaning of jihad, how it's expressed, and why is it that in the Western context, so few leaders, so few with cultural influence, recognize or acknowledge the risk that this represents to our countries?
Yeah. So on jihad, again, I refer you to my article, Is Islam a Religion of Peace, which goes through all the texts in some detail and argues about it in detail. The Arabic word does mean striving or fighting, although there are Muslims who will just say it means war. I was reading one the other day, a sort of an Islamic scholar who said jihad is our word for war. But yes, so here's one example from Surah 2, 216 onwards. Fighting is prescribed for you, and you dislike it, but it's possible you dislike a thing which is good for you, and you love a thing which is bad for you. Indeed, those who have believed and those who have emigrated and fought, that's jihad, in the cause of Allah, those expect the mercy of Allah, and Allah is forgiving and merciful. And then there's another one here that makes very clear as well, Surah 495, not equal are those believers who sit at home and receive no hurt, and those who strive and fight, jihad, in the cause of Allah with their goods and persons. Allah grants a grade higher to those who strive and fight with their goods and persons than to those who sit at home. Those who strive and fight is distinguished above those who sit at home by a special reward. And there are many other hadith that and verses in the Quran that talk about jihad, something like 140 plus verses that advocate violence in the Quran. And of course they are, if you look particularly at Surah 9, which is the last surah which revealed, and therefore it has the greatest authority. You've got verses like Surah 9:5, kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, and Surah 9:29, about killing people until they pay the jizya tax and are humiliated, which is the verse that Taqi Usmani was referencing when he said that. Now, why do people not understand what Islam is like? They bought into the idea that we're all sort of Abrahamic faiths, true Islam is peaceful, true Islam is lovely. These radicals are weird and odd, and you get radicals in any religion or any group, and so that's nothing to do with Islam really. They're just kind of crazy people, and they've not looked at the texts, and they've not looked at actually what Muhammad did. And they, when I was working in finance, I said to my colleagues who were like, Oxbridge educated, very quick people, very sharp people, I said Muhammad was a warlord and he fought lots of battles, and they're like, what are you on about? That's complete nonsense. They had no idea that that's the case. They just disbelieved me. There's complete disbelief when I said that, and that is the truth. And Muslims will say that, and it's there in all the records and so on. Basically the liberal elite in this country just cannot have no conception that even Muhammad was a warlord, let alone that his texts advocate violence. They just do not know this and cannot believe it, and will go and say, but I've met a lovely Muslim person who's lovely and friendly and cuddly and gentle, and so how can you must be completely wrong about this, and they're not interested in following up and finding out about it. So we are completely blind to it as far as I can see now. People are starting to wake up a bit, I think, because of the level of Islamization that has come about, the threats, the demonstrations that you've just shown, the extent to which people are demanding respect for Islam or not respecting Christianity and so on. And, police getting involved when a kid scuffs a Quran in the school is crazy, and demands for sort of an Islamic blasphemy type law and so on. I wrote a report for the Free Speech Union here in the UK about that. And more people are waking up to the reality of what Islam is like, but we've got a long way to go still. And the fact is that most people still want to believe that Islam is lovely and friendly and gentle and peaceful, and I've got lovely, friendly, peaceful, gentle Muslim neighbors and so on. And the multicultural dogma is that all cultures are equal and so on, and we've been taught this, and it's taught heavily, of course, to kids in schools, in the education system and so on. My kids in a Church of England school, my son was taught that Islam is lovely for women and respects women and treats women with dignity, and Christianity disrespects women and discriminates against women. And that's what they teach in a Church of England school, and they teach that to the kids. So this is what they're all taught. Now obviously some kids can see through that, but when the teacher is asked, what about polygamy or something, they say, well, I have to be careful what I say. So, there is a massive indoctrination attempt to try and say, Islam is really lovely and peaceful. You've got nothing to worry about. Please be friends with all your Muslim friends. Well, we should be friends with them. Great. But we should persuade them and show them what is wrong with Islam, and what Muhammad is really like, and compare Muhammad to Jesus is what I always try and say and do. And Muhammad said, kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, and Jesus said, love your enemies. I mean, and not quite apart from the fact that Muhammad's dead and Jesus raised from the dead. Muhammad hurt people, Jesus healed people. Muhammad did no miracles, Jesus did lots of miracles. Muhammad's birth was ordinary, Jesus' birth was extraordinary, and all these other things. Why would you ever follow Muhammad or you follow Jesus? And these are the kinds of things that we need to point out and show people what Islam is really like, and show people why they need to follow Jesus and not Muhammad.
Yeah. Do you think that there's an element with this? Obviously, that you've explained why multiculturalism and secularism there, have a false view of Islam, and it's been used, in a sense, Islam has been used by the progressive secular establishment as a wedge against Christianity, to say, we're a multicultural society, we can't really be called a Christian society anymore. And I think that's reflected in what you've just said about the education system. When such blatant lies can be told about Christianity and Islam, with the desire to paint Islam in a way that the Quran and the Sunnah certainly never paint it, secularism obviously is there using Islam as a wedge to say, well, we're not a Christian culture anymore. Tim, is there an element, though, also within Christian theology which has made us weak in responding to this as the church? Is there a kind of two kingdoms sort of element here, where Islam is, claims to be about a kingdom that's in the world? It's practical, it's social, it's political, it applies to all elements of social life and family life and everything else. But the Christian church has been told for certainly 70 or 80 years that it's Christianity is about the last 100 years of evangelicalism primarily. It's about souls going to heaven. It's about your personal piety, your personal prayers, going to church, Bible reading. But actually applying the faith, the lordship of Christ, to culture, including political life, has not really been on the church's agenda. Have we ended up inadvertently, in the name of piety, making actually massive room for Islam to move in and fill a void that Christianity has left, with really the church having to carry some blame for that?
I totally agree with what you're saying, Joe, and I'm sure that's right. That's absolutely part of what happened. Is Christianity has conceded ground and considered not very important ground, and so churches have been sold off to become mosques, as if that doesn't matter very much somehow, because it's kind of like, it's just a building, kind of thing, when it actually does matter. It's very, very symbolic, and it's very powerful cultural thing for a church to now be a mosque. And you may know the bomber in the Ariana Grande bombing came from a mosque that meets in what used to be a Methodist chapel, and stuff. So radical Islam being preached in what used to be churches. I also think that Christians have had it very easy in the West, in what was a broadly Christian culture, and became lazy and didn't really have to engage very hard in evangelism, and didn't really have to think too hard about things. And now, as Christianity, as the culture becomes anti-Christian or oppressively anti-Christian, and Muslims are very, very, very assertive, aggressively assertive and confident and bold about their faith, and say it very, very confidently and boldly. And Christians, by comparison, look weak and feminine, and I don't want to offend anybody by saying something, and so let's be very careful about this. Well, I'm afraid we're never going to win the country or regain the country or confront Islam without being bold and courageous and confident and very assertive about Christianity. And I don't see that happening, sadly, in the church very much today, with rare exceptions. There are not people who are being very assertive about this. There are not many Christians who are teaching about Islam, in the churches. Have you been to a church service where I've talked about Islam, for example? Not very much. But I happened to mention my book, Questions Asked Your Muslim Friends, when I was preaching somewhere the other day, and several people came and asked me, where can I get hold of this book, and so on. And when I've spoken about Islam in churches recently, my book sells out. because people are hungry for how do I talk to my Muslim friends about their faith, and how do I engage, and what is, what can I say about Islam, because we don't know anything about Islam. We've talked a lot. The other thing that's happened is we lived in what we thought was becoming increasingly secular culture, and so we trained everyone about secular apologetics, how to criticize atheism, and nobody has been trained in how to criticize Islam. And actually, Islam is, I think, the much greater threat here. There aren't actually very many atheists actually out there on the streets and in your schools and neighborhoods and relatives and friends, but in your neighborhoods there will be Muslims if you live in any of the big cities here in London, and there will be Muslims in your schools and so on. And I've got teenagers in my church who are hungry for my book, and reading it and starting to engage their Muslim friends. And this is exactly what we need: confident Christians engaging their Muslim friends about their faith and challenging them and talking about it. And that is the only way that things will change.
Well, we're going to make sure that the links to your book and the articles that you've mentioned are in the show, Tim, for people to get hold of. As again, just a reminder, Tim is fellow, Ezra Institute Fellow for Public Policy, and he's spoken at our programs in the past. He's contributed to our journal, and he's been on our podcast before. So we're going to encourage you to read those articles, get hold of his book. Tim, a sort of penultimate question, and then I want to leave the last question to Michael, really, but because we've got a few minutes here still. One of the things that we've seen, and we saw it in the clips that we watched earlier, is the massive rise of anti-Semitism in these marches in the major cities in the West, in these sit-ins at universities. Not to mention the rhetoric of politicians. I mean, a politician elected up north for the Green Party, shouting Allahu Akbar upon his victory, although I very much doubt he would sign off on the Green Party's view of sexuality, gender, and identity. So we've got this these chants of "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," that we've been hearing on a regular basis, intifada, revolution, and anti-Jewish sentiment and language, coffins with Stars of David painted on the side, all these sorts of things going on. And sometimes it's dismissed as, well, this isn't anti-Jewish, it's just anti-Zionist. It's anti the actions of the state of Israel. This is the cop-out, and I've heard it even from Anglican ministers, even in my own area, that I've had to challenge on the issue of anti-Semitism. Can you just talk a bit about Islam and anti-Semitism and what we're seeing right now in the streets and at the universities? And we've seen it for months. Is there a relationship between what's going on and anti-Semitism? And is this some kind of phase 2 jihad that's going on here? Some kind of a sort of an attempted sort of movement that's spreading, that's part of the broader Islamic agenda?
Yeah. So again, I've written an article called "Is Islam Anti-Semitic?" and I'm going to expand an article on that in the near future, just showing how, from the text, again, not to say all Muslims are anti-Semitic, much like I say with "Is Islam a religion of peace?" There are many peaceful Muslims, and in relation to anti-Semitism, not all Muslims are anti-Semitic either. But if you go to the text, let's look at like Surah 564. It's clearly referring to Jews. It says, "And we've cast among them animosity and hatred until the day of resurrection. Every time they kindled the fire of war against you, Allah extinguished it, and they strive through the land, causing corruption, and Allah does not like corrupters." Or another verse, 582, "You will surely find the most intense of the people in animosity towards the believers to be the Jews, and those who associate others with Allah." Or another verse, in fact, there are 3 times where the Jews is cursed as apes and pigs in the Quran. Here's one of them, Surah 7:166. "When they were insolent about that which they'd been forbidden, we said to them, be apes, despised, and mentioned when your Lord declared that he would surely continue to send upon them," that's the Jews, "until the day of resurrection, those who would afflict them with the worst torment." Notice it says until the day of resurrection, so that's right throughout all time. Then you obviously have the jihad verses, like 9:29, which I mentioned earlier, "Fight against those who don't believe in Allah in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and the messengers have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who are given the scripture, that means Jews and Christians, until they give you a jizya tax, that's the subjugation tax, willing while they're humbled or humiliated. And so 60 verse 4, we've denied you, and there appeared between us and you animosity and hatred forever, until you believe in Allah alone. And then, of course, you have the hadith that is quoted in the Hamas charter, where Allah's messenger said, that means Muhammad said, the hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, "O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." That's cited in Article 7 of the Hamas Charter. 2011 poll that found that 73% of Palestinians agree with this hadith. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Mufti Muhammad Hussein, expressed his agreement with this hadith in 2012. And so anti-Semitism goes right back to the Quran. It doesn't start with 1948. It doesn't start with the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's very much ingrained in Islamic theology, right there in the Quran and the Hadith. I forgot to mention, or shall I add, that Muhammad ordered the slaughtering of 600 Jews from the Jewish tribe when they surrendered to him unconditionally. He just said, "Well, just kill all the men who were aged over puberty," and they were all killed there right in front of him. Which is basically religious genocide, is what Muhammad carried out there. So this kind of anti-Semitism is there. If you go to memory, you can see regularly anti-Semitic sermons being preached in mosques in the States and in other places around the world, where they are citing the Quran and quoting it and saying this justifies anti-Semitism, and they're doing it brazenly, broadcasting it on social media. And so organizations like Memory can pick it up and highlight it to the rest of us, even in English and sometimes in Arabic as well. So yes, Islam is anti-Semitic, and the rise in anti-Semitism, partly fueled by the Arab-Israeli conflict, sure, but it is also right there in the Quran, in the Hadith, and in the origins of Islam, and in what Muhammad actually said as well. What was part two of your question? Sorry, Jane.
The to do with the marches and the sit-ins and all of that, that there is a very, very strong Islamic presence in all of that. There's, the widely regarded as an anti-Semitic chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," the Jews feeling unsafe in London, and like there's places that are no-go zones. This seems to be almost like an Islamic movement, and there's an interesting anomaly, which might be worth your comment too, in that, which is there seems to be a coalition, and there has been a coalition for some time, of Islam with the Marxists, with the hard left. Maybe you can just make a remark on that as well.
Yeah, well, I very much Islam is behind this, but there are lots of people going along with it who know nothing about Islam and who wouldn't call themselves Muslims either, but they've bought into this sympathy for the Palestinian cause, or sympathy for the Gaza cause, let's say. And you even have this very extraordinary thing of things like Queers for Palestine, and you just sort of think, do you know what Sharia law says about homosexuality and so on? And what, do you know what Hamas would say? Have you read the Hamas Charter and exactly how anti-Semitic it is, and exactly what they're saying they would do, and exactly how they want to rule the nation, and their slogan, what does it say? Sharia is our way and Jihad is our method, or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it says now, but it's exactly that kind of thing. Somehow there's an incredible spiritual blindness with people siding with Hamas, with all that means in terms of the radical Islamic thinking that is, in black and white out there in the Hamas Charter and things, and not seeing it for what it really is. Alongside it, as you say, there's Marxism and so on. I think you and I both saw this interview that Suella Braverman did with one of the student protesters in Cambridge, who refused to say anything about Hamas and said, "Oh, that's not the issue, that's a distraction," and so on, and then sort of let slip that it's really capitalism that she's upset about. As if that's the problem. That's what causes all the wars and problems in the world. You have to laugh or cry, because she's meant to be a highly educated person, and she actually thinks that capitalism is really what's causing the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it really is not. I mean, it is Islam that's causing it. And Suella Braverman could have pushed back harder. But anyway, yes, they have united in an extraordinary alliance. One way of putting it is to say that Marxism and Islam have the same father or the same God, and ultimately it's Satan behind them both, and that's why they're aligned. Maybe that's the point. But yes, there's an extraordinary alliance. At some point, I think it will fall over because they are so different in their actual aims and what they really believe. But it's out there and it's obvious to see, but people are absolutely blind to it at the moment.
Yeah.
So, Tim, it's been great to hear your analysis and your thoughts on these matters. As I listen to you and I listen to Joe even describing the setting, I know that many Christians are asking the question, what do we do about this? Could you answer both in the evangelistic sense and also in the legal sense? I think that it has to be a both and strategy rather than an either or strategy to try to deal with the encroachment of Islam on the world. So as Islam amps up, what do you recommend Christians do legally and evangelistically?
Yeah. So the response to Islam from Christians, I mean, in the article I wrote recently called The Challenge of Islam, I sort of outlined 5 pillars of how Christians can respond to Islam, because everyone knows that Islam's got 5 pillars. So I thought here's a handy way of sort of working out how to respond to it. And one of them, of course, is prayer. But let's start with prayer, because it is a spiritual battle at the end of the day. And our struggle is not against flesh and blood, and it is really prayer, and Islam is a spiritual entity. And so we very much need to pray into this and pray for God's mercy and pray for God to reveal what Islam is really like. The other one is love, because, of course, Jesus said, love our enemies. So we cannot respond with hate. We must respond with love. We have to love our Muslim neighbors, love Muslims, and love those who are Muslims are the greatest victims of Islam, right? They're caught up in a deception. They're caught up in a lie. And so we very much have love for those who are caught up in that, and we want to reach them because we love them. But thirdly, confront. And it's a mistake to see confrontation as unloving. Jesus confronted the Pharisees in the most forthright manner. You look at Matthew 23 and all that he said there, and he loved them. And that's why he confronted them, because he wanted them to see through the lies and hypocrisy that they had. And Paul confronted the Athenians with the futility of their idolatry as well. And Paul publicly confronted Peter as well. So, and Paul said we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And Islam is exactly that. It's an argument and pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And it needs a demolition job, a spiritual demolition job. And that's why we need to be prepared to absolutely tear apart Islamic apologetics, tear apart Islamic arguments. It can be done. Many resources. Obviously, my book, Questions to Ask Your Muslim Friends, helps with that. But we've got to be capable of totally critiquing what Muslims are saying and explaining why their claims are nonsense and are wrong and are sometimes lies. And then we need to expose it as well. And this is partly what we're doing here in this podcast, isn't it? Saying what Islam is like, explaining what Islam is really like, explaining what Muhammad taught, explaining how Islam is anti-Semitic and what jihad means and how Islamic law is brutal and horrific and is being advocated by Islamic scholars today. And finally, resist it. And resistance includes legal methods. Great success story here was the resistance of the mega mosque plan, which was planned for the Olympic Games here in London, and some Christians mounted a campaign against it and managed to successfully block it from being done, but also resisting it in other ways in law and freedoms, and resisting, for example, a Sharia blasphemy code in law, and arguing for free speech and explaining what it would really mean. All of those kind of things are important in how Christians respond to Islam.
Yeah. Well, Tim,
That's great.
That's been a pretty comprehensive show today on the subject of Islam, and I'm glad we're able to end on that note of the importance of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the love of God expressed in and through Christ, even for his enemies, loving our enemies, sharing the gospel, making known the goodness of Christ to our Muslim neighbors, whilst at the same time confronting Islam as a false ideology of which Muslims are the first and primary victims. And so that's a great way to bring this to a conclusion. I think this is probably a good moment to flag up that, to remind people to watch this space, because in November 1st and 2nd, we're looking at a Mission of God conference in the UK, in which we're going to be dealing with the topic of Islam. So right now, that's just to mark your calendar for the 1st and 2nd, certainly the 2nd, Saturday, the 2nd of November, possibly something going on the 1st as well, but mark the 2nd of November in your calendar if you're in the UK, for a Mission of God conference on Islam, and that will be a joint event with the Ezra Center and Christian Concern, and Tim Dieppe will be speaking. I'll be speaking as well, and we'll have some other exciting guests coming to speak on this issue. It desperately needs to be addressed, and so we're going to be tackling that at our Mission of God conference in the UK this year. All that remains for me to say then is thank you very much, Tim, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And I'll conclude.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Tim. Michael, thank you as well. And I'll conclude by saying, as we always sign off the show, for from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen.